Hello, anatomy students. Welcome back. This is part 2 of the female sexual cycle. We just finished talking about the ovarian cycle, and now we're going to talk about the uterine cycle. And when we're talking about the uterine cycle, what we're talking about is changes in the endometrium that occur on a monthly basis in response to the secretion of the 5 hormones that we talked about: GnRH, FSH, LH, and estrogen and progesterone. And so if we take a look at our graph here, you can see that we're going to start on day 0 with the very beginning of menstruation or the menstrual flow. That's going to usually last about 5 days. And then we enter into the first phase of the uterine phase called the proliferative phase. And if something is proliferating, it's increasing. And that's exactly what's happening to the endometrial lining. It's starting to thicken, and that's due to the work of estrogen. At this dotted line where we have day 14, this is when ovulation occurs, and now we have the secretion of progesterone from the corpus luteum, and that's going to maintain our endometrial lining. It's going to stimulate the glands that we see here in the endometrial lining to secrete glycogen, which is present in the event that the ovulated oocyte gets fertilized by a sperm in the fallopian tube. And then that new zygote travels to and implants itself into the lining of the uterus. That way it's ready. That zygote is going to need the nutrients from that glycogen in order to grow and develop into a viable fetus. So that's the whole point of this part of the cycle. It's to prepare the uterus to support a pregnancy. And so, as I mentioned before, that's going to occur at the same time as the ovarian phase. So, and the part that we're going to start out with then is just this low amounts of FSH that are being released, because at the very beginning of our menstrual cycle, we have low amounts of GnRH because we have low amounts of estrogen. We have low amounts of progesterone because our corpus luteum is now degenerating and releasing less progesterone. And so with this low frequency of GnRH being released into the bloodstream, the anterior pituitary responds by secreting FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So even while menstruation is occurring for days 1 through 5, our follicle is starting to grow because of stimulation by FSH. And so after about 5 days, that endometrial lining is now shed, menstruation stops, but the endometrium doesn't stop changing because our follicle is still growing. And if we remember correctly, as the follicle grows, more and more estrogen is being produced. At about day 12, day 13, we have the spike in estrogen. And I'm going to come back up here to the top because high levels of estrogen are going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release a burst of GnRH, and that causes a burst of LH called the LH surge. That's what we're looking at here by this black line to reach its peak. That's going to cause ovulation, and that's what's happening here at this dotted line. Well, after ovulation occurs, we need to look now at the proliferative phase, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand that pre-ovulation, we have estrogen, 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 estrogen going up, 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 and that's going to cause this thickening of our endometrial lining. After ovulation, our estrogen levels are going to go down, see this blue line, but our progesterone levels go up. And as our progesterone levels go up, that's going to help to maintain the thickness of that endometrial lining. As our corpus luteum, however, starts to degenerate, and this is only going to happen if fertilization does not occur, when this corpus luteum gets smaller, 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 progesterone levels are getting lower, 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 and so is estrogen. And so at the end of a 28-day cycle then, We are going to have the lowest levels of progesterone and estrogen that we have. Our hypothalamus is going to be stimulated to inhibit the release of LH, but to secrete more FSH to start another follicle growing. And then these low levels of progesterone are going to stop maintaining that endometrial lining and allow it to be shed in the menstrual phase again. And so that is how the uterine phase coincides with our ovarian phase. And we just went through all of these different graphs. There we go. All right, so let's wrap this up. It's all about feedback after all. When estrogen levels and progesterone levels are high, that's going to inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing large amounts of GnRH. That means that our LH levels especially are low. FSH levels are low as well, but FSH is being secreted. Okay, and so this is going to prevent our follicles from maturing. And then is there a pregnancy? If we do have fertilization, then we're going to keep that corpus luteum around for a while, and estrogen and progesterone levels are going to be high. If pregnancy has not occurred, then the new follicle is going to mature, and that's where those levels of FSH are going to be important, because as FSH is secreted, the follicle is going to grow, and as the follicle grows, estrogen, more and more estrogen is going to be secreted. The bigger the follicle, the more estrogen it's going to secrete. When we have the follicle at its largest, when it's a mature follicle, also known as a Graafian follicle, it's going to release its largest burst of estrogen. That stimulates the hypothalamus to release its highest burst of GnRH, and that's going to cause our LH surge. The LH surge causes ovulation, and estrogen and progesterone are going to be high because we have that corpus luteum intact, and that's going to stick around as long as pregnancy occurs. If not, the levels of estrogen and progesterone fall as the corpus luteum degenerates, and we get the beginning of the cycle, day 1 through day 5, which is menstruation. And that's all for part 2, everybody. Thanks for listening, and go on to part 3 where we'll tie it all together.